Again with Dr. Gaven Kerr. It's always too long between these conversations. I did find out, Gavin, it's been 9 months since we last spoke, which is crazy because it doesn't seem that long, yet it also does.
Yeah.
And we have you back on today to talk about the real distinction. You've been doing more work, new work on this again. Obviously, we've done a lot, throughout the years on this podcast, talking about Aquinas's metaphysical system, how he establishes the real distinction, why this is so important for his philosophy of God and cosmological reasoning. I would encourage people to go back and find the conversation we did maybe 2 years ago, where we looked at like the deepest and toughest objections to his De Ente argument. I really liked that. That was a great conversation. It's definitely in the weeds, but I'll encourage people to check that out. But as always, you're doing lots of different work. What made you want to come back to this area? I know you were kind of going back into epistemology for a while, and I was a little surprised to hear, you're working on this again. So give us a little backstory there.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, I have been working on epistemology for a while to get the dissertation up to publishable standards. So, I mean, I was deep in the weeds of Kant and Neo-Kantian stuff and, Rorty, Sellers, all of that sort of stuff. But the reason why I came back to this issue of distinguishing essence from existence is I was invited by Daniel Dehaan to a conference in Oxford on Aquinas' metaphysical thoughts, particularly on essence and existence. And I knew that Ed Fieser had offered good-natured criticism of my reading of the Intellectus Essentiae argument in De Ente chapter 4. So, and I'd seen other people defend the interpretation of the Intellectus Essentiae argument that it establishes real distinction and not just conceptual distinction, whereas I had argued it only established conceptual distinction. So I'd seen that this real distinction interpretation was being offered of that argument. So I thought the Oxford conference, it would be a good opportunity just to present my considered view, which is still the same as it was 10 years ago when Aquinas' Way to God came out, that the Intellectus Essentiae argument only establishes conceptual distinction, whereas you need to top it up with the impossible multiplication argument to get real distinction. So that's just the paper that I was delivering at Oxford, and there was a number of very good people there. But one of the issues that came up, it wasn't an issue I was addressing, but it certainly came up in discussion, was this objection that David Twetton makes that arguments for real distinction all fail because they all presuppose that there's something like Thomist Esse, the act of existence within our ontology. And what the arguments are just doing is trying to, fit it into the right place of our ontology. But Twetton's objection is, the Aristotelian will just respond that we don't need Esse, we don't need the act of existence in our ontology, and we can explain everything that needs to be explained without Esse.
Form is enough, right? That's the idea. Right?
Yeah. So whilst that wasn't anything sort of being explicitly addressed at the conference, and it certainly wasn't something that I was really that I had on my radar, because I mean, I did write, something to the effect that I think Twetton's objection fails in my 2015 book. It really was coming up as an issue with Thomistic metaphysics, and so myself and Daniel agreed that this is probably something that we need to look at a wee bit more deeply. Hopefully, we'll get a conference out of it. And so, in preparing my conference paper for publication, I decided to expand it and go into this objection from Twetton. Hence, why I'm working on this and why we're chatting today.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I have not read that, obviously, so this is going to be all new material for me as well. So where should we? Yeah, so where should we start? I mean, part of me wants to say maybe we should do a little bit more background for people who aren't totally familiar with everything we just talked about. The other part of me is like, well, we've done that a million times before. I'll let you decide. Do you want to do any initial stage setting before we get into your new paper here? Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe just to just give the context, just with Thomas and the act of existence. Thomas thinks that everything other than God is composed out of essence and existence, the act of existence. The act of existence is a fundamental metaphysical principle of things without which nothing would be. It is the act of all acts, the perfection of all perfections. And so it's distinct from matter, form, and thus essence in a creature. It's, I want to say, idiosyncratic. It's unique to Thomas, his account of Esse and the metaphysics of Esse. You don't find it in Aristotle or Plato. You might get something like it in the Neoplatonists, But in the historic Aristotle, you just don't get anything like the active existence. Form is actuality enough. Form is the most fundamental principle of actuality. So it's something new that Thomas introduced into his ontology, and it was in order to avoid what was known as universal hylomorphism. This was the idea that everything other than God, in order to be composite, is composed of matter and form. Even immaterial creatures, they have a kind of matter, a spiritual matter, which just isn't corporeal. And then physical creatures, they have matter which is corporeal, and it's made corporeal by their form. So Thomas wants to avoid universal hylomorphism, and he has objections to it, but he needs an alternative in its place. What accounts for the compositeness of all creatures, immaterial creatures included? And that's why he introduces the distinction between essence and the active existence. So that's sort of the context. Once you get that, you've understood Thomistic metaphysics.
So it really is that, no pun intended, simple, but right, for Aquinas, it all comes down to this divide between the composite and the simple, right? And that's an interesting, and tell me if you think this is right, because, a lot of times in contemporary philosophy, religion, philosophy of God, people sort of divide the created and the creator between the contingent and the necessary. And it's not that Aquinas or Thomas would disagree with that. They would just say, well, there's a deeper story behind the contingency and necessity, right? Like things are contingent insofar as they are metaphysically composite, and God is, maybe necessary isn't the best word, but let's say ontologically independent insofar as he's absolutely simple being whose essence just is his existence. Is that right?
And that's an important point to bring out, because in after Leibniz, this whole distinction of God and creatures as between the necessary and the contingent, to center place. Leibniz did an awful lot of sort of work explaining and clarifying this distinction between the contingent and the necessary. But in Thomas, it's quite striking that Thomas doesn't really discuss God and creatures in terms of the contingent or the necessary. He does have robust metaphysical notions of contingency and necessity, but it's not his primary go-to in explicating the creator-creature relationship. It's in fact the metaphysics of essence and existence. So that's more fundamental for Thomas than necessary and contingent. And he has a whole apparatus for dealing with the necessary and contingent. But what's fundamental for him is this distinction between essence and existence and the role that the active existence plays in the creature.
Yeah, and I think that's nice, right? Because it does seem totally sensible to be able to ask, well, why are things contingent, or why is something necessary? And maybe there's other answers out there, but it seems like Thomas's system gives a pretty nice one to that question. Right?
I agree.
Okay. So continue. Yep.
So that's where we're at. So Twetton raises this objection. Says, look, see these arguments for real distinction. They all presuppose that you have something like Thomist Esse in our ontology, and what the arguments are doing is they're just taking Esse and seeing where it fits in with essence. Is it distinct? Is it identical? But it all presupposes that you have Thomist Esse within our ontology. So that was his objection. Now, he has since changed his mind. He did publish a piece it was a Polish journal dedicated to my 2015 book, and he published this piece in it where he changes his mind, and he does think that we can have a successful argument for the real distinction. But the issue that came up at the conference was just how do we answer that objection from Twetton, or an objection like that. A Scotus could come in and say, well, look, we can explain everything in terms of matter, form, haiketas, let's say. What do we need Thomist Esse for? What's it doing? And more fundamentally, how do we discover Thomist Esse, the active existence? What's our initial sort of clue that triggers that insight that there might be something more to a thing than just its matter and form? And so that's what I've been working on.
Okay, so let me ask, just for clarification, is the problem that the presupposition is that existence is a first level property attributed to concrete individuals, or is the problem that it's already assuming a real distinction? Because those seem like different things to me, right? You might say the first thing, but ultimately say that, oh, well, what we're identifying there just is the individual, right? But not necessarily the real distinction. And then that would obviously be unhelpful if you're trying to establish the real distinction by assuming it. But if you aren't assuming the real distinction, then the first one isn't totally unhelpful. I mean, maybe you need to give some reasons for why you think existence isn't just a property of propositional functions or something like that, right? But actually something that you can attribute to concrete individuals. But you could still move from there to the real distinction. So help me think through that. What's the issue?
Yeah. So Tweden does think that Thomas, well, in his earlier article, the Thomas are begging the question that they've already assumed that, that very robust view of existence, that it's a real feature of things and it's distinct from the things of which it is a real feature. So they are presupposing what they seek to prove when they.
So they're just assuming the conclusion at that point, right? Yeah, that's what he's saying. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so part of the work that I'm doing is I'm trying to give an account for how it is that we discover the act of existence as more than just the fact of something's actually existing. Okay, so everybody's aware of the fact that things exist, but they explain that in terms of, let's say, matter and form or propositional functions, second order predicate, that sort of stuff. How do we get from recognition of the fact of something's existing to some sort of awareness that there might be some metaphysical act here which is making the thing exist, which accounts for that fact that is the act of existence. And so part of my work is looking into that, especially, Thomas's account of how we discover the subject matter of metaphysics, in which subject matter will be included. The act of existence is, part of that subject matter. So maybe she would get into that.
Yeah, no, please. That'd be great. And then remind me to pick your brain about two other approaches that I've seen used. If you don't mention them, I'd like to circle back to them, but continue on your path for now.
Yeah. So Thomas wrote, I think it was during his first teaching stint at Paris, he wrote a commentary on the De Trinitate of Boethius. And in questions 5 and 6 of the De Trinitate, he gives an account of how the sciences are divided up and the methods that the sciences use. The sciences that he has in mind are the speculative sciences, physics, mathematics, and divine science. That's metaphysics and theology. And the way in which he does it is that he argues sciences are divided on the basis of their formal objects. So a science takes a particular formal object, a subject matter for study, and you have different sciences given the different subject matters. And how do we divide up the subject matters of the sciences, Thomas asks? Well, we do so by distinguishing the different kinds or classes of things which are knowable. Okay, their knowability, how they can be known. And he has a threefold division. He first of all argues that things are knowable in terms of their universality and necessity. Okay, so when you know something, there has to be some sort of universality to it, and it has to be necessary in a certain way. That is to say, it's not constantly changing or in flux. Sure. There's some kind of universality there that you're coming to terms with. And so the degree to which an object is related to matter and motion will condition it in its universality and necessity. So the degree to which an object related to matter and motion conditions its universality and necessity. And Thomas outlines 3 degrees here. First of all, there's objects that depend on matter and motion in order to be and in order to be understood. And these objects, depending on matter and motion to be and to be understood, these are the subject matter of the physical sciences because matter is included within their very definitions. Thomas then argues that there are certain objects which depend on matter in order to be, but not to be understood, and these are the objects of mathematics. So mathematical objects are physical things, but we don't consider them in terms of their physicality. So we consider them independently of matter and motion. But then Thomas says there's a third class of thing, and these are things which depend on matter and motion, neither to be nor to be understood. Okay, they're not dependent on matter and motion for their existing or for their being understood. And Thomas subdivides, Thomas calls this divine science, considers these immaterial things, but he subdivides the divine science. He says, first of all, there are certain immaterial things which are wholly immaterial substances. They can never be found to be in material things, that's such as God and the angels, okay? And in order to consider those, we need to make use of special revelation. They're not proportionate to our perceptual powers, so we need to make use of special revelation, and so it's theology proper that considers those. But then there are certain immaterial things which can be found to be in material things, but also be found to be amongst immaterial things. And it's these things that the philosopher considers when he considers metaphysics. So as I read Thomas here, Thomas holds that there are certain categorical features of things which are neutral with regard to being found amongst material or immaterial things. John Whipple calls these the neutrally immaterial. And since they can be found to be amongst material things, they can be known through our direct perceptual experiences of individual physical things in the world, and so they can be considered exhaustively by natural reason. That's what the metaphysician does. So Thomas holds that we have this subject matter of metaphysics. Elsewhere, he calls it ens commune, common being, and it pertains to both material and immaterial things, and that stands to reason, because if we have a science of being as being, which Aristotle describes first philosophy as, it's going to consider what is common to both material and immaterial things. So that's the subject matter of metaphysics. Now, do you want to stop there, or will we continue?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Good rehearsal, right? That physics studies mobile being, metaphysics studies whatever is common to being as such. So I'm good there. Let's keep charging forward, right? Yeah.
Okay. So in question 5 of the De Trinitate, in one of the articles, I think it's Article 3, Thomas has asked the question. Well, he asks the question: can mathematics properly consider something which is dependent on matter and motion in order to be, but not to be understood? Surely you would be understanding it in a way different from its actual existence, in which case you're not understanding things properly. So if we're understanding mathematical objects not in terms of their material being, then surely we're thinking falsehoods about mathematical objects. And Thomas takes this opportunity to describe different ways in which we can abstract. Okay, so he uses the term abstraction, and he holds there are different forms of that abstraction can take. And what he just means by abstraction is the ability to distinguish, that intellectual ability to distinguish one thing from another. And what he argues in that article is that there's 2 operations of the intellect. The first operation of the intellect is the understanding of essence or quiddity. Okay, so it's the understanding of the essence of something. And then the second operation of the intellect is the sort of recognition of the existence of something. It's called composition and division. It's when you form a proposition, and that proposition is reflective of the reality of the thing. Yeah. Thomas argues that when it comes to the first operation of the intellect, the understanding of essence, we can distinguish one thing from another without falsehood, because that operation of the intellect doesn't pertain to the reality of things. So we can entertain, different sort of concepts in abstraction from the actual things that they are concepts about. And that's because that operation of the intellect doesn't pertain to the reality of things. But insofar as the second operation of the intellect pertains to the reality of things, we can't abstract, or what Thomas calls separate, what is not already abstract and distinguished in reality, because that operation of the intellect does pertain to the reality of things. So any abstractions we make there have to be reflected in reality itself. Yeah. Thomas argues that physics and mathematics make use of the first type of abstraction pertaining to the first operation of the intellect, whereas the metaphysician makes use of the abstraction proper to the second operation of the intellect, so proper to that operation which has regards to the real existence of things. And I found this interesting because insofar as the metaphysician is making use of a certain type of intellectual operation which pertains to the actual existence of things, it's in the confrontation of that operation of the intellect with reality that will find the subject matter of metaphysics, and in turn will find the esse of things. Yeah. We'll get some sort of insight or justification for there being an active existence in things. So do you want me to keep going with that?
Yeah, no, this is good. A lot of thoughts here. So I mean, it's to kind of angle into this, it does seem like we're going to need at least at this point some sort of broadly Thomistic like cognitional theory, right? Mm-hmm. And this is interesting too, because like the Thomistic cognitional theory and epistemology, this is something I've been thinking a little bit about, maybe pick your brain about it a little bit. It's like, sure, it's pretty different than contemporary epistemology, right? Because like take I mean, for one example, it seems like error and falsity only relate to that second thing that you're talking about, composition and division, right?
Yeah.
That's where we make mistakes. But it's like, it seems like that's like the domain of knowledge broadly for a lot of, I mean, to give an example, take like proper functionalism, which is a hit among the kids these days, right? That we have knowledge when, we form beliefs are occasioned in us in the right environment by faculties that are generally aimed at truth, have a high objective probability of getting it. Like, that seems like knowledge just is propositional knowledge in a certain context. But like, it seems like that's only an account of knowledge, maybe with respect to the traditional order of judgment, right? But what about that first kind of more infallible, right? Knowledge, if you will. I don't know, that could take us down a totally different track, but it's I've been trying to think lately, okay, how does the classical epistemologists relate to the contemporary epistemologists with these? Like, are they compatible? I think there's got to be some sort of maybe I have a few quick thoughts on that before we go forward.
Yeah. So I mean, there's an awful lot to unpack there, and maybe we should do another episode just on Thomistic epistemology.
I think we should. This would be a very interesting area for a lot of people, for sure.
Yeah. But what I would say to it is that I think Richard Rorty, his book Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, I think it's a pretty good critique of contemporary epistemology, post-Cartesian, post-Lockean epistemology. He makes the critique that after Descartes, what philosophers were interested in is getting the perfect mirror image in our minds of the world out there. There was the in here and there was the out there. And the role that the philosopher played was to get that perfect mirror image, that the representations had to be correct. And Rory just makes this diagnosis all the way down through the centuries, that they're always concerned about getting this correct mirror image. They're concerned about being right. They're not concerned about mind and world coming into conformity with each other. They're just concerned that their beliefs, their representations, their ideas are correct, that they correctly represent. Right. And Rory diagnoses that right down into the 20th century. Different strands of analytic philosophy, phenomenology. He argues that they all employ this idea of the mind as a mirror of nature. And he even critiques Aristotle. He thinks that Aristotle, is prone to this. Now, I think that I don't think that Aristotle or Aristotelianism does use that mirror imagery. I think that Thomas is much more like our post-Kantian critics of that mirror imagery, that for Thomas, the mind is a set of capacities which are brought into operation when they meet their proper content. Okay, so the mind works with concepts, and so it functions through a set of conceptual capacities. So when the mind meets something that is itself conceptual or formed, shall we say, the mind is awoken and brought into operation. And so there's an intentionality to the mind whereby it recognizes the conceptual or formed content of reality. That would be the broad picture of the Thomistic epistemology that I would subscribe to. And then you have the mechanisms of cognition, where first of all, you have that first sort of operation of the intellect, whereby we form concepts about things.
Sort of simple apprehension, right?
Yeah. We start forming concepts, but we don't get to the truth of the matter because until we get to composition and division, which is the second operation, precisely because we can form any sort of concepts that we want. But once we start putting them together and saying that, that this describes what I'm perceiving, like
that this is that, or this is not that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's once you start forming that propositional content, that's where you get into the truth or falsity of things. And Thomas argues that second operation of the intellect, that is sensitive to the actual existence of things. That's where the intellect seeks to, conform itself to the actual existence of things. Whereas in the first operation, that's where you can come up with all sorts of crazy, wonderful, and wild ideas.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like the proper there's other examples, but the proper functionalist is saying something like, this is when those sorts of judgments could count as legitimate knowledge, for example, right?
Yeah.
So there's a conversation to be had there about whether that's useful, compatible, necessary, whatever. But we'll bug you to come back on and talk about that another time. For now, I guess the main point, which I really want to do, that would be fun. The main point, though, is we're using this sort of traditional cognitional theory to get to where we ultimately want to go, which is to a Thomistic notion of esse, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so continue. Yeah.
So You have this second operation of the intellect, and it's that intellectual operation which is characteristic of metaphysical thought. That's what the metaphysician is using. And it pertains to the actual existence of the thing. And what I want to swing back to is something that Thomas says at the beginning of the De Veritate, and he also says it at the very beginning of the De Ente et Essentia, and it's that being or ends is what the intellect first conceives and into which it resolves its concepts. So being is what the intellect first conceives and into which it resolves its concepts. What is the being that Thomas has in mind here? What is the end, the ends that Thomas has in mind? What's the ends that say that second operation of the intellect is sensitive to? On my reading, it's the individual concrete particular. We're met in perceptual experience with concrete particulars, and we engage with them and we have acts of knowledge pertaining to them all the time, constantly. We couldn't move about in the world unless we did engage with these things intellectually. We just take it for granted. I know, how to operate and move about within my own home and amongst my family and my work colleagues and that sort of stuff. And you just couldn't do that if you didn't have some sort of intellectual activity which was sensitive to the actual existence of things. So I hold that's the ends, that's the being which brings the intellect into operation, because that's the being of everyday awareness. But when we engage with beings in their actual existence, if we're scientifically minded, we can start abstracting. We can start engaging in the kinds of abstractions that Thomas talked about when we divided up the different sciences. And we can consider, our concrete particulars, say as, this is, this concrete particular in front of me. We can say this is a tree. We can start categorizing it. This tree is 20 foot tall. This tree is particular type of tree, and so on. And that's how scientific thinking starts coming in, when we start recognizing these deeper features of things rather than just that they're a concrete particular there in front of me. And when we engage in metaphysics, one of the things that I point out is that insofar as the second operation of the intellect is sensitive to the actual existence of things, we begin to be aware that there's something more to the existence of things than just their matter and their form. So there's something more to them than that. And why is that? Well, think about it. You have, an existing thing which is impressing itself upon you. You didn't ask to perceive this thing. You didn't give it permission to perceive this thing in front of you. It just impresses, it pushes itself upon you. Now, how does it do that? Well, it needs to be material in order to do that, but it's not through the thing's matter that it impresses itself upon you. Matter is just a passive receiving principle for form. Is it the form? And this is what the Aristotelian would say this. Well, insofar as the form is the fundamental principle of act, it's the form which allows the object to act on you. But if that were the case, if it was the form of the thing enabling the thing to sort of impress itself upon you, then you would have an immediate awareness of the form. In the same way that you have an immediate awareness of light or color or something like that. If it was the form impressing itself upon you, you would just have an immediate intellectual awareness of the form, because that's the thing which is acting upon you and making itself manifest. But you don't. When you're met with a physical object, maybe something that you don't understand, you have to try and wrestle with it and figure it out. The form is, in a sense, hidden, and you have to go through, the difficult activities of thought to actually figure out what the form is. So what is it that is impressing itself upon our perceptual capacities? What is it that is, just making the thing present and there in my current perceptual activity? Well, it's neither the matter nor the form. So there's something more than just the matter and the form by which this thing is present to me right here and right now. And what I'm arguing is that that's the initial insight which leads us down the path towards Esse. That the argumentation for real distinction springboards from that sort of original, how would you put it, phenomenological experience. Sure. There's just something real and present to me right now, and there's something rather than nothing, and it's not accounted for in terms of its matter and its form. And that's whenever the arguments for real distinction kick in.
And that itself isn't assuming the real distinction. It's just assuming, say, a generally thicker notion of existence, right?
Yeah, just that there's an ontological depth to the thing by which it is there and is present, which needs to be accounted for. and it can't be accounted for in terms of matter and form. This is when the arguments for real distinction come in. Its actual existence here and present can't be accounted for in terms of anything formal or anything pertaining to the essence in the thing. So with the arguments for real distinction, then we move to recognizing a distinct active existence by which that thing is present right here, right now.
Yeah, that in virtue of which this thing has the whatever actuality it does. Okay, good. I like that. That's really neat. Is there anything else you want to say about that, or
well, I mean,
yeah.
In responding to Twetten or a Twetten-like objection, or something that a Scotus might come up with, or a traditional Aristotelian might come up with, it's not that the active existence is being presupposed. Rather, it's that in that sort of intellectual engagement with things through our second operation, we're made aware of something with an ontological depth to it, by means of which it is something rather than nothing. It is there present before us. And then if we run the argumentation for real distinction, we realize that added sort of ontological depth is nothing in the essence of the thing. And so we have a distinct sort of active existence as an act, not just a fact that we recognize, but some sort of actuality in the thing by means of which it can be present to us. I think that gets around Twetten's objection, and it allows us just to do the Thomistic metaphysics of Esse.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that is a successful dodge there. So my next question then is, whether or not you think this is compatible or supported by a couple other approaches. I'll mention two, and maybe you can think of more. One is certainly controversial among Thomists. I have to say, I do not have a settled position on this, but it would be Barry Miller's move through philosophy of language, right? So he thinks that, this at least in these situations, the predicates stand for real properties, and he doesn't say that language is a perfect mirror of ontology. He says it's dusty with Crummett, but he says it's the best mirror we have. And he thinks at least when it comes to certain atomic propositions like Socrates exists, you can move through philosophy of language to make a real good case for this, especially when you do what he does and show that all the objections against this position fail. So his is kind of both a philosophy of language case plus common sense case, plus this is why the objections against it aren't any good. So this is where we'll just start. So there's that approach. Then there's the other approach, which is sort of Norris Clarke's, I guess, where he just kind of posits it as a very fruitful theory, where he's like, look, if maybe you shouldn't, throw explanatory posits out there willy-nilly. We don't want to be extravagant, but like we have all these philosophical problems. A big one is the one in the many. And it doesn't seem like unless we have this explanatory entity in active existence, we're going to be able to really handle the one of them, like form and matter on enough. It's enough along one dimension, right? But not another dimension of the problem of the one and the many. So he thinks if we really want to, like as a theory, it's just really fruitful, and we're in poverty. We can't explain everything that we need to explain if we leave this posit out. So I just threw two other things out there. Whatever comments you want to make, it would be
yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
So I think what we need to do is distinguish between, say, the task of metaphysics as addressing certain problems and the activity of the metaphysician as a thinker. I think the task of metaphysics is, it is the one in the many. Okay, I do think it is the one in the many, understood in terms of how do we account for the unity and multiplicity of being. Okay, how do we give a full account for the unity and multiplicity of being? And so I do think that is the fundamental task of metaphysics. And I think that includes why there is something rather than nothing.
Yeah.
And so as a task for metaphysics, I think Thomas's metaphysics of Esse is correct. I think the Neoplatonists, generally had things right with this hierarchical sort of vision of reality, going right back to Plato and, the divided line in the Republic. I think the Neoplatonists had that right, but I think they were wrong to hold that it's the one which does it, because the one is still a kind of a form. I know the one and the good aren't really forms for Plato and the Neoplatonists, but there is still something kind of formal to it. And I don't think something like the one can, be what we base out at ontologically, because I don't think the one distinguishes between something rather than nothing. I think the act of existence is what does that, or esse is what does that. You can't go beyond esse, because beyond esse there is nothing. But I think fundamentally Thomas and the Neoplatonists are trying to get at the same thing, something that, grounds our ontology, without which we have nothing. So as a task for metaphysics, I do like Norris Clarke's approach, that we're trying to deal with these big metaphysical issues, such as the one in the many, and we have this account that Thomas gives, and it's good theory, and it explains everything that needs to be explained. But when it comes to the task of the metaphysician, I think, finds himself in much more sort of Heideggerian terms, that he's living in the everydayness of things, and is aware of beings around him, and not just the metaphysician, but the scientific thinker as well. What distinguishes a scientific thinker from a non-scientific thinker? It's not like your non-scientist isn't aware of the being of things, or isn't aware of the richness and what can be known about things around them. They're just not in a pattern of experience or a form of life whereby that's of a going concern for them. When you're doing the school run in the morning and looking after kids and family and everything, you're not in a pattern of life where, let's say, the biological reality of something is a going concern for you. But the scientific thinker is someone who has made a particular domain of reality a going concern for them, and the metaphysician is the same. And ultimately it comes down to what Plato and Aristotle described as the wonder, which is the beginning of all philosophy, that there's something sort of wondrous or astonishing about the sheer reality of things, and definitely the metaphysician is like that, and in being astonished about the sheer reality of things, seeks to come to terms with it and categorize it accordingly. And it's the metaphysician, as a practitioner of metaphysics, finds himself in that situation and gives an account for the being of things around him, which will include an account which answers the one in the many.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, talk to me real quick. These days in philosophy, people tend to hyper specialize. They do epistemology or they do metaphysics. What's the right attitude here? Is one more important than the other? Should you begin with one rather than the other? Obviously, as we've tried to develop these ideas, we're hopping over these lines all the time, right? So your quick thoughts on that. Yep.
Yeah, so biographically speaking, on an autobiographical note, epistemology was my first love, but also, metaphysics kind of went hand in hand with epistemology. Sometimes it's almost like you got to do both. But I wouldn't endorse the hyper specialization that you do see in contemporary philosophy. I just describe myself as a philosopher, and I engage in the different branches of philosophy. I think there are 4 branches of philosophy: metaphysics, which is the philosophy of being; epistemology, which is the philosophy of being as known; moral philosophy, which is the philosophy of being as acted upon and acting; and then you have logic as a common methodology, which they all adopt. And then your different philosophy of disciplines, I think, just take those main branches of philosophy and they apply them to a particular subject matter, like philosophy of language, philosophy of religion, so on and so forth. So I think philosophers really should aim at doing all of philosophy and not just hyper specialize in one branch of philosophy. I think it was the Scottish model of the philosophy departments or philosophy at the universities, which really distinguished between these different branches of philosophy, that you're the professor of logic and metaphysics, or you're the professor of moral philosophy, or you're the professor of anthropology. I think it was the Scottish model during the Scottish Enlightenment that made these distinctions. Whereas I think you should just be a philosopher and, just do all branches of philosophy.
Everything's connected. Everything matters, right? It's you start asking questions in one area. Soon you'll be asking questions in another area. And so it's like, what other choice do you ultimately have, right? If you want to try to get to the bottom of things. So good. All right. So I know we didn't talk about the arguments for the real distinction. We aren't going to rehearse those again, because we've done probably at least 5 different conversations on those. This was really just to address this absurd this objection from Quentin, which was super helpful. Any kind of wrapping thoughts on this, Gavin, or where you plan to go with this project? Moving forward.
The original talk, it was responding to, in fact, it was responding to Ed Fieser and others who they hold that there's an argument in the De Ente chapter 4 called the Intellectus Essentiae argument. Now, I've always held that only gives us a conceptual distinction between essence and existence. What it does is that it establishes, on my reading, that what it is to understand the essence of something is distinct from understanding its existence. But Fieser and others have argued, they've disagreed with me, and they've argued that the Intellectus Essentiae argument, in making these distinctions, envisages real things about which they're making distinctions. So, for example, a mathematician in doing geometry can make all sorts of distinctions which apply to, let's say, triangles. And if triangles exist, they will exhibit these distinctions. So similarly, the metaphysician, in making distinctions about essence and existence in the Intellectus Essentiae argument, it's reasoned, well, if such physical things, medium-sized dry goods, exist, the distinctions that the Intellectus Essentiae argument makes will pertain to those things. That's the general sort of argument that they've made. Now, I have a problem with that insofar as the only distinctions that you can make which would apply to real things if they exist are going to be formal distinctions, such as, the distinctions pertaining to, the nature and the angles of a triangle. They can only be formal distinctions because in order to know a thing of such a type actually exists, the formal content that you use in order to characterize that thing and pick it out in reality has to be the correct type of content. Otherwise, it's not that thing picked out in reality, in which case any distinctions which pertain to it will just, in virtue of that, be correct and apply to the thing. Otherwise, you're not picking out, let's say, a triangle in reality. But to my mind, that presupposes the real distinction. It doesn't seek to establish the real distinction in things. I'm sorry if that sounded a bit rambling, but that's
good.
One of my objections to that sort of Fieser approach to the Intellectus Essentiae argument. It's a kind of an intra-Thomistic disagreement. We all accept that Thomas did make a real distinction. It's just where did he make it? So
where did he get it? Yeah. So you've got, and it's like solid players on both lines of that divide, right? So I mean, you and Whipple and others say no, it wasn't until the multiplicity argument. Fieser's got some company too, though, right? So he's got like Oderberg over there with him. Who else?
Yeah, Stephen Long,
I believe. Right? Yeah.
Anthony Kenny, but I'm not sure if you want Anthony Kenny as an ally.
Yeah, bad company, right?
Yeah.
Awesome, good. Well, I'm sure this will satisfy our many metaphysician and Thomistic nerds here. Before we wrap this one up, Gavin, and before I bug you to come on to talk epistemology, which people have been wanting more, what else are you working on? What other projects you got coming down the pipeline?
There's a few wee bits and pieces. A lot of my time is taken up just, being a registrar at the university. But I've been working on this notion that, the good is that which all desire. That Platonic principle. Well, I've been working on this idea that has its proper fulfillment. It'll be no surprise to the Thomist. That has its proper fulfillment in the beatific vision. So the good is that which all desire. It's the final end of all creation. It culminates in the beatific vision. If that's the case, okay, then the Christian ideal, it cannot be, something like, it can't prioritize social justice as the good. Social justice might be a means of getting to the good, but it's not the good itself. So the Christian ideal, whilst it may have a social ethic, cannot be exhausted by its social ethic. And so I'm working on this, that, the good is that which all desire is only fulfilled within the beatific vision. So at the resurrection, it's part of my ongoing work on the resurrection.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I have some thoughts on that, but I'll talk to you about it off air because they're only half baked. So,
but it's meant that I've been engaging with liberation theology and all that sort of stuff, theology of liberation. So I've been working on that, and as I say, I've been working on getting the dissertation up and running, ready for publication. I just submitted the final manuscript for an edited volume, Thomism Revisited, which is coming out with Cambridge. I got the manuscript off to Cambridge for that.
Oh, great!
So that's gonna be in the works, and I've also been invited by various others to contribute chapters on. There's going to be various handbooks to Summa Contra Gentiles, the Summa Theologiae, and I've been asked to contribute chapters to that, on the nature. One of them's on the existence of God, another one is God as omnipotent creator. So I'm going to be, you're going to see a few chapters from me in those various handbooks which are coming out.
Great. Looking forward to all of it, Gavin, and looking forward to our next chat, which hopefully won't be too long from now. So until then, thank you. Thank all the gentle listeners, and please like, share, subscribe to the podcast. Bye-bye.
Thank you.